We trust the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant.
Are there still structural racism issues today, or is that something of the past that we're just dealing with its effects?
Yes. So, all right. So, a couple of examples. I think one famous one that people are familiar with is crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. That when it comes to punishing crack cocaine, you punish crack cocaine much harsher, same amount as powder cocaine, even though, from what I'm told, they have the same basic effect. African Americans tend to use crack cocaine, and so those punishment, the harsher punishments, are on African Americans for doing basically what whites are doing with powder cocaine. That the law itself is not intentionally written to be racist, but the way it is implemented is, unfortunately, it impacts African Americans more than European Americans. So that's one example. The whole redlining thing, and not just redlining, when we look at housing audit studies, when we look at the loan mortgage guarantee program, the way it was originally set up our society to be residentially segregated. So, not only African Americans living in the ghettos, but Hispanic Americans living in the barrios, Native Americans on reservations, we had the segregation. There's all sorts of ramifications of this segregation. Now, technically, a person can move to wherever they can afford to. So there's not a legal where it was has. But we know that when you have your family have been living there, your chances are your kids are going to be closer there, and they're going to stay in this neighborhood. And there still is some evidence of discrimination that reinforces this sort of segregation, even though it's not as overt as it used to be. Once you have residential segregation, you have all sorts of negative outputs. For example, we know that the value of homes tends to go up at a slower rate in Black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. It makes sense because if you have less people who want to move in there, then your homes are not going to be as valuable. We know that there's less resources in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. When I grew up, when I went to Amarillo, I was in Amarillo, there's only 2 grocery stores in the whole Black area of town. There are dozens of grocery stores in the rest of the town, and there's not that many more whites than Blacks in that town. We know that when you have this sort of segregation, that that there's an effect from this book called American Apartheid, which talks about the concentration of dysfunctions in the community. And so when you segregate a lower class community, you're going to get more intense crime, you get more intense educational problems. And that's another issue. When you segregate, then you can create a Black school or a Hispanic school, and then how are those schools treated? We know a lot of times they don't get the resources of other schools. So there's a lot of problems connected to segregation. And even though we don't have the laws against it, but historically what's happened is created these Black and Hispanic neighborhoods and Native Americans, and I've gone into the problems of reservations, that create additional problems for African Americans and Hispanic Americans. And so those are a couple of examples of how, even though we don't have the laws in the books today, people of color get the short end of the stick oftentimes.
Yeah, and you can be as non-racist as you can be. I mean,
Yeah.
and yet if you are in a structure, a system that perpetuates the effects of past racism or currently today enforces something that is racist, at least an outcome, you live in a racist society. Even if you as a person aren't racist at all, even if every American wasn't racist, we still have the structures left over from that are affecting African Americans disproportionately in a negative way. But here's the thing, I don't know how to fix that. I don't understand what we're supposed to do to repair that. I mean, there was a illustration that Christian Smith and Michael Emerson, and you wrote a book with Michael Emerson, I believe, they used in their book called Dividing Race. And
Divided by Faith?
Divided by Faith, yeah, thank you. And it was a story of a baseball game. And so picture in the 7th inning, and you find out that one team is winning 20-0, but it's also discovered that they are cheating. And so they admit it. They say, you're right, we were cheating. That's why we're up 20-0. Hey, let's finish the game, and we won't cheat anymore. And if you were on the losing side of that game, you might say, well, hang on a second. I'm glad you're not going to cheat anymore, but how are we going to handle the fact that you're up 20-0? We can't just complete the game. And yet that's the world we're in. We can't go back and start over and start our country over or start the world over again. We live in a fallen, broken world where there's a lot of injustice and a lot of disadvantages. How do we fix those?
Yeah, so once again, the question is, given a history of racial abuse, how do we create fairness? And also acknowledging that the mechanisms that were overt are gone today. And I think that, I think it's legitimate for whites to fear that some of the corrections will overcorrect. Because history, that's what tends to happen, right? Look at Cuba. Cuba was a reaction to oppression, and then Castro came along, and there's an overcorrection. So how do we negotiate this? And that's why I think it's very important that we have a collaborative conversation approach. That we come into it, we share our concerns, and we try to find solutions that move us forward, and solutions that bring people on board. I believe that not all, but most whites, if they engage in collaborative conversation with people of color, are not going to give everything that we want, and that's probably a good thing. Humans don't work well getting everything that we want, but we'll be more attuned to the problems that have emerged and want to try to correct them. And I think that is what's missing. The problem with both approaches, ultimately, both of them say, look, we're the solution, you buy our solution, and that's what's going to fix the problem. That does not work in our society. That does not work in general for humans. We got to have solutions where we come together to have real conversations, not monologues, real conversations to fix these solutions. And when we put everything on the table, we see the reality of everything on the table. We're trying to figure it out from that point forward.
And is this what you call mutual accountability?
Yes, mutual accountability or collaborative conversations.
And where does that going to happen? Because when I read this mutual accountability in opposition to colorblindness or anti-racism, it sounds so attractive. I just don't know how to have that conversation, who to even have it with, who's going to be in that conversation, who gets a seat at the table. Is this a local thing, a state thing, a national thing, a church thing, a business thing? Where does this happen? Do you have a vision for how it gets kind of played out in life?
Yeah, so, different problems will happen at different levels, obviously. Right now, I'm trying to do some research where I'm trying to study doing this in churches and in Christian schools and hopefully Christian colleges. But I also hope to eventually branch out into doing this with non-Christian schools and public institutions and school boards and things of this nature. So, you can happen at that level. I'll tell you where we've already seen it work to some degree is the same research that shows that anti-racism techniques do not increase the number of managers hired of color shows that when you take those white managers and say, hey, can you help us solve the problem? Can you mentor people? Can you lead up our diversity task force? Take those white managers, you actually get more people. So when you bring people on board and solve the problem together, you get the result that you want. When you try to stigmatize them into doing what you want them to do, you don't get the result that you want. So we've seen it work in businesses. And there's actually a study out there in the highest ranked journal that shows that it works in businesses. I think we can get it to work in different institutions. And at some point, yes, we're going to deal with national, federal issues. We have to figure out how we're going to do this in the federal government. But I think if it's working at the lower levels, we will figure it out how to do the federal government. But I think we got to get it working in our churches, in our schools, and in our parachurch organizations first.
Well, I agree that we need to start at grassroots, and it would be great if the church led the way and showed our culture a better way. That Jesus unifies us in a way that the world wants unity but can't ever find it apart from Jesus. And it makes sense to me that we're better off starting at the grassroots on smaller local levels instead of on a national level, which some days just seems utterly hopeless. One of the topics today that everybody's talking about is Christian nationalism. And, we referred to it a little bit earlier in Christian identity politics and that kind of thing. And just for our sake here, I'll just say Christian nationalism is a wedding of civil government with some form of Christian faith to give people power on a government level. And I am completely reject every form of Christian nationalism. But I want to ask you a question that I think maybe is a little sensitive. I hope you aren't offended by it. One of the things that Christian nationalists are critiqued for, and I think rightly critiqued, is trying to merge government and the church together. But what I see in the Black church is sometimes doing the same thing. Like
Hmm.
Vice President Harris spoke at the
Yeah.
National Association Baptist Convention. You see Democratic politicians speak in black
Hmm.
churches. And there seems to be a merger there of
Yeah.
politics and faith that doesn't get the same critique when it
Hmm.
happens in the white church. Now, I'm
Right.
against
Yeah.
it at all points and every side, but can you
Yeah.
help me understand why one is vociferously, enthusiastically critiqued and the other kind of gets a pass?
Yeah. So, Christian nationalism is an interesting topic. I actually am a critic of the way we're trying to measure Christian nationalism. I think that's created some of the problems.
Hmm.
And stop me, this gets into the weeds too much because I don't want to go nerd on
Let's
y'all.
go.
But the scale used, I think, does not work. I don't think it's a valid scale. I think it measures something else. What I think it measures is trying people who want to, and I don't know this for certain because I've not done the research. I'm not sure I'm going to do the research because I'm busy enough. But what I think it measures is the degree to which people support certain Christian-inspired ideas in the government. For something, perhaps something like abortion, or something like issues around religious freedom, or issues around Christian. Now, the problem with that is you could do that with just about any special interest group. I think you're seeing the Black church. You can argue that there's a Black nationalism scale you could create about people who advocate for issues that are pertaining to what African Americans generally see as wanting, or feminist nationalism scale. I think you could probably create those scales. We've decided to focus in on Christians creating those sort of scales. Having said that, I do think, and I run across Christians who do have the idea. I think a guy just came out with the book, and I've not read it, and I don't have plans to read it, on the case of Christian nationalism. And from what I've heard about it, it actually advocates a Christian form of government. There are Christians who want that. I just don't know what percentage of the population that truly is, and I don't trust the scale to measure that because I think the scale is flawed, and I've done some investigating. It's never been truly validated qualitatively, and so it opens itself up for critiques of, well, what do people mean when they answer these questions on your scale? I don't think we really know what they mean.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot of terms that are used, and maybe there's different definitions for them. But I still kind of want your opinion on whether you're okay with politicians and the Black church working so closely together inside of worship services, inside of denominations, or if you think that that's not right, regardless if it's happening in the white church or Black church, or maybe you think it's fine in both places. I don't know, just the inconsistency.
Yeah, okay, so all right, so I just wanted to get on board on Christian nationalism that I think it exists. I don't think we do a good job measuring it, and I'm doubtful of a lot of research on it.
Okay.
To the point at hand, my pastor preached something a few years ago, and this is where I'm at. If on the morning at the election, you think that we're saved because of who we elected, or you think we're doomed because of who you were elected, then Christ is not your God.
Amen.
Not your Lord.
That's
where I come from. So that describes where I come from. And so I'm uncomfortable with, I'm not uncomfortable with teaching values. I'm not uncomfortable with the pastor going up there teaching about justice or teaching about being pro-life, saving lives. I'm not uncomfortable with that because those are values that I think the pastors should be teaching. I am uncomfortable when it gets partisan. When pastors allow people to come and say, vote this way, or we are Republicans or we are Democrats. That I don't like. And I'm grateful to be in a church that does not do that. It teaches values. If you go to our church probably is very concerned with racial justice, and we don't mind preaching about that. We also are a church that supports the notion of abortion is wrong. But you can support those things without saying, and therefore vote for such and such and so on, and leave it up to me to decide who I'm going to vote for. So yeah, I don't say, oh, because African Americans are doing this, now it's okay. No, I just assume not have it in my church.
Toward the end of your book, I think this is where the quote is. You quote Dr. King. It's 1962, and he says this. He says, people fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other. And you referred earlier to the Samaritans and Jews. They had the same story, right? I mean, they didn't live together. They didn't shop in the same markets. They didn't worship in the same temple. And so it explains a little bit of why James and John thought it might be a good idea to destroy the Samaritan village. They asked Jesus, hey, can we napalm this village? They'd heard a lot about Samaritans, but they didn't know any Samaritans. It explains, like you said earlier, why they were shocked when Jesus was talking to a Samaritan woman at the well, because you didn't talk to Samaritans. It explains why, like you said earlier, the parable of the Good Samaritan was so offensive to them. They didn't know there were any good Samaritans. And yet, not long after they want to call down fire and destroy the Samaritans, Jesus is crucified, he's resurrected, and Jesus is winning Samaritans to himself. He's drawing Samaritans are now becoming Christ followers. So I can imagine James and John sitting in a worship service with some of the Samaritans who they had wanted to kill not long before. And I think, well, Jesus has this chance to unify us. And yet I think what Dr. King said is still true, that we still fear each other because we don't know each other, and we don't know each other because we haven't talked to each other. And like you explained earlier, we tend to live in the segregated communities that have been established long ago, and they're still, to some extent, a large extent, still enforced, not legally, but just socially. So do you have any hope for communication? Because your whole thing is built around collaborative communication, mutual accountability, sitting down, processing, learning, listening. As the guy who's pushing this idea, and I think it's a great idea, by the way. Help me, give me a little hope, give us a little hope of how that's going to happen when it seems like we're in the same place that you were in the 1960s, in the same place that we were in the first century.
I think, my hope is in the long term. I realize this is not going to happen overnight. And so I have to be in here for the long term, probably the rest of my life. I think more about my kids' lives, that maybe they'll see the full fruition of these efforts. I think it's actually an opportunity for the church in a post-Christian world to show the world something that they're not seeing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm at least starting in the church. I will work with non-Christian groups, but I'm at least starting in the church at this point in time, because I want the church to really provide this solution. I want the church to really emerge and to stop taking sides and to bring them together. So I think that is my hope. I do think, the research suggests this should work. So if we can really start getting momentum, it should work. And so I'm eager to work with people to help to make it work. But yeah, it's a long term. I mean, unfortunately, next year, the solution will not arrive in full force. It's going to take a lot of work.
Hey, I'm Keith. Thanks for watching the video. If you're interested in ending tribalism like we are, we have a podcast and a book. Both are called Truth Over Tribe. You can listen to the podcast on Apple or Spotify, and you can get the book off Amazon. I hope you'll check them out.